In this video, we're going to learn how to identify what type of hazmat is being shown on a shipping paper. This video is critical for basic understanding moving forward. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify the hazmat class. We will get into Table 1 and Table 2 and talk about some placarding and some of the exceptions that exist. Here we are looking at some of the hazmat information on a bill of lading. You will notice the shipping paper is letting us know there is hazmat because of an X under the column heading HM. HM stands for hazmat, and the X is indicating that this is a hazardous material. We will get into shipping papers in greater detail in another video, but here, moving from left to right, they are telling us quantity, type, pieces, a description of the pieces, i.e. the one at the top shows one box, the weight of the hazmat is the next column. On the top, it's showing us 2 pounds for that first one. Next is the column indicating the hazmat. Skip past the column labeled OD, as this one does not apply to what we're learning. The next column is our commodity description, and what I want you to notice here is that they all start the same way with the letters UN and a 4-digit number. Like the top one begins with UN 3090 lithium metal batteries. The hazmat commodity basic description will always begin with the same way, UN and a 4-digit number or NA and a 4-digit number. UN stands for United Nations, while NA stands for North America. Let's go ahead and break down the information of that top hazmat on the BOL. It was UN 3090, comma, lithium metal batteries, comma, 9, comma, Roman numeral 2. UN 3090. First, this is our identification number. The next entry is lithium metal batteries, and that's our proper shipping name. There's another comma, and the next is the number 9. This is what you want to always remember. The hazmat class is going to be the first number after the shipping name. That's our hazmat class. So we always want to be able to find the hazmat class, and that's class 9. We could then jump into one of two tables, Table 1 and Table 2. If you're using a Hazardous Materials Compliance Pocketbook, you will find this around page 36 under the General Requirements area of the book. Depending on the book you're using and the edition, the pages might have changed some. You can also find the table online. There's a link to where to look inside the video description. So we remember the hazmat class on the last one was 9. If we look at this little chart, this is Table 2 we're looking at here, the very bottom number, 9, says Class 9 is the placard. So our hazard class is Class 9. Just looking at some other ones on there, just above it is the number 8, and next to it, it tells us, hey, the hazmat class is corrosive. This is probably the most important part of moving forward with training. You want to understand how to identify the hazmat class and what hazmat you're dealing with just by looking at a bill of lading. So in this case, we know 9 meant Class 9. So we're going to go over a handful of examples of this. So let's move to the next one. Here we've got UN 1090. Now as soon as we look at this, we can see the first number after the words is the number 3. So that is our hazmat class, because it will always be the number that is right after the words. And in this case, if we look up number 3, we're going to see that 3 is a flammable liquid. It's going to say placard you should put on this is flammable. And again, where you're finding that information is you need to jump to Table 2, look up, hey, what's the 3? And it's going to show you right there. 3 says flammable next to it. The next one, UN 1717, here we're going to see two numbers. We've got the number 3, and then in parentheses, we see the number 8. 3 is the hazmat class. Again, we're dealing with a flammable. The 8 is a subsidiary hazard. What this is telling most shippers is what label codes to put on. Aside from 3, I'm also going to put the label code 8 for corrosive, but this has nothing to do with placarding, and this is not your hazmat class. It's simply a subsidiary hazard, meaning aside from being flammable, which it is mostly, it is also a corrosive. Okay, let's look at another one. This one is UN 3511. Now take a moment, look at all the words, and decide what is the hazmat class on this one. Now go ahead and jump to Table 2. Go ahead, if you need a little more time, pause the video before you get the answer. If you're doing this correctly, the correct answer was 2.2, which was non-flammable gas. So that's 2.2 non-flammable gas. Looking at the next one, we've got UN 1391. Now look at this again, and again I want you to pick out what's the hazmat class. Now take a moment. Hopefully by now you've already figured out where to look it up. Pause the video if you need a little more time. In this case, it shows up in Table 1, and it's 4.3 dangerous when wet. 4.3 dangerous when wet. Okay, now we're on to the last example. This is UN 2335. And again, take a moment, figure out what the hazmat class is. Okay, pause the video if you need more time. Now as we're looking, the hazmat class is 3. So we know we want a placard with flammable. Next to it in parentheses, again, we've got a 6.1. That's letting us know it's a subsidiary hazard, that aside from being flammable, which is this main risk, it also is potentially poison or toxic to, human life. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about some of the exceptions that exist, but before we do, I want to say, if you're confused at all about hazmat class and how to identify the hazmat class, stop now. Stop and start over, or stop and get some assistance. I'm happy to spend some time teaching anyone who needs a little more help on how to identify the hazmat class. But if you can't identify the hazmat class, nothing else we're going to teach is going to make any sense. So if you're not comfortable with the hazmat class at this point, stop and get some assistance. Table 1 materials have some of the most dangerous hazardous materials on it. That is not to say Table 2 hazmat is safe. They all pose risks and dangers. But Table 1 is dangerous enough that JAS Trucking does not move any Table 1 materials. Many of the Table 1 materials require $5 million worth of liability coverage. Table 1 must have placards at any quantity. There are some exceptions, but they are extremely rare. An example of an exception that exists is a poison inhalation hazard used in a minimal amount to protect wine only, requires a sticker on the door that warns everyone of the potential danger, but does not require placarded hazmat or a hazmat driver. With that said, that's the only exception I've encountered in 20 years of doing hazmat. So any amount of hazmat in Table 1 requires placards and a driver with hazmat endorsement. It also requires the carrier to have a hazmat registration. Table 2 materials have a number of different exceptions. The one most people have heard of is the under 1,000 pounds exception. If your total weight of Table 2 materials is under 1,000 pounds, non-bulk only, the load does not require placards or a hazmat endorsed driver. General rule of thumb is that if the load does not require placards, it does not require a hazmat endorsed driver. The carrier moving the freight still must have at least $1 million in liability insurance. The carrier also must provide hazmat training if they are moving any hazardous material, even under 1,000 pounds. Being under 1,000 pounds non-bulk Table 2 only accepts you from a few different rules. Hazmat endorsed driver requirement and the placarding rules. The rest of the hazmat rules still need to be followed, like having a copy of the BOL with the information on it. There is still what is called permissive placarding, which allows you to placard a Table 2 material even when it's not required, provided the hazardous material is on the load in question. Bulk always gets placarded. Table 1 or Table 2, no matter what, bulk is always placarded. What do they mean by bulk? A bulk definition is no intermediate form of containment. That means the trailer, container, the giant tanker is holding the freight. There's no other device of the freight inside. So for instance, if you have a load of apples but it's in boxes, inside the trailer or container, that's not a bulk load. However, if only the trailer itself were holding the apples, that would be a bulk load. Nothing else is holding the materials except the trailer container itself. It also means a maximum capacity greater than 119 gallons as a receptacle for liquid. So that means if the device itself can hold more than 119 gallons. It doesn't have to have more than 119 gallons. It can have 1 gallon, but because the receptacle itself meets the definition, suddenly you're a bulk load and you would require tanker. Totes are what we run into the most when it comes to this. Here is a photo of a tote. It also means a maximum net mass greater than 882 pounds and a maximum capacity greater than 119 gallons as a receptacle for a solid, or a water capacity greater than 1,000 pounds as a receptacle for gas. Looking at the first one, UN 1090 acetone, we can see it's 1,200 pounds. So the question first is, do I need a hazmat endorsed driver? Well, it's more than 1,000 pounds, right? We can see it's a flammable liquid. Yes, we're going to need a hazmat endorsed driver, and this needs to be placarded. It's 1,200 pounds of a table 2 material. Now we're looking at UN 1717. That again, it looks like it's a flammable liquid. It's 500 pounds, so placards are not required. We could put them on. Permissive placarding would allow that, but we do not have to placard it, nor are we required to use a hazardous materials endorsed driver. Now our next example, we can see we have two different hazmats here. We've got a 2.2, right, and a class 3. One is 1,002 pounds, and then its finalized load, there is 1 pound of class 3. So the question is, what do we need to placard here? Well, certainly the 2.2, it's over 1,000 pounds. But because the entire load is more than 1,000 pounds, we need to placard both the 2.2, and we're also going to put on the flammable liquid placard. And our last example here is UN 1391. Here we've got 4 pounds of 4.3. So when we look, do we need to placard this one? Do we need a hazmat endorsed driver? Well, this is a table 1, dangerous when wet, which we always placard. So absolutely will require placards and a hazardous materials endorsed driver. Okay, now let's go through some of the exceptions that exist for placarding. However, as you go through these, know that the railroad does often have different rules. One of the most common exceptions to placarding is Class 9 miscellaneous does not require placards. However, when dealing with the railroad, even if it's a domestic shipment, they will require if it's more than 1,000 pounds, at least as of the day I made this video in 2023. But some of the other exceptions include infectious substances, 6.2 materials. Another would be combustible materials provided they are non-bulk. Number 3 is ORMD materials, the consumer commodity exception. What this essentially says is if it's packaged like you'd buy it in the store, it's no more dangerous on your truck than it would be in the store. So things like Windex bottles, as long as they're bottled like you buy them in the store, fall under this exception and do not require placards. Limited quantities. These must be identified on the shipping paper, and I'll show you an example or two here of a limited quantity. When you see limited quantity, this means that the amount of hazmat involved is smaller than the actual material. It's a very small amount of hazmat. So they're allowed to say under the limited quantity exception, it doesn't require a hazardous endorsed driver, nor does it require placards. The next example is radioactive class 7, 1 or 2 packing group labels. Another is small quantities. This deals with exceptions where the actual hazmat inside the overall good is a smaller amount, less than 1 ounce for liquids, and you can find that at 173.4. Then there's accepted quantities at 173.4. This exception falls into small quantities that require special packaging to meet the exception. The idea is that an inner package and an outer package are used, which would have enough to absorb the material if it were to break or leak. Now that you know how to choose placards and when to put them on, let's take a look at how you put the placards on. So placards must be placed on all 4 sides of the tractor trailer away from markings, which would reduce the effectiveness of the placard and displayed horizontally from left to right. Each placard must be readily visible from the direction it faces. If it's a container movement, it must be 2 feet from the top of the container. This is because railroad rules make it so that it's easier to see those placards. It's a shipper responsibility to offer the correct placards. It's a carrier's responsibility to check and make sure they have the correct ones. They also must maintain them during transport. Should a placard fall off or get dirty, it is important that you put a new placard on or clean off the placard so that it is still readily visible during transport. Once a container is empty and no longer contains the hazardous materials, the placards must be removed. You cannot leave the placards on and drive with an empty container or trailer. If there's residue, that's a different story. Then you can placard under permissive placarding rules. But for the most part, when you're dealing with dry vans or containers, there would be no exception to keep the placards on. Okay, now let's talk about the dangerous placard. The dangerous placard is never a requirement. It's more of an exception. A dangerous placard can only be used in a domestic shipment. It basically says if you have more than 1,001 pounds gross weight of 2 or more categories of Table 2 only, must be non-bulk, and none of the hazmat types can weigh more than 2,205, instead of using 1 or 2 or 3 placards, you could just use the dangerous placard. However, if one did weigh more than 2,205 pounds individually, you'd be in a big trouble with the dangerous placard. I never suggest the dangerous placard, typically because when we're making a pickup at a location, they're providing us the placards, and very rarely will they pass out dangerous placards. When you're at the railroad, sometimes they'll say this requires a dangerous placard, but that's them being lazy. Essentially, there is more than one way to placard most of the materials found, and dangerous is never required. It can be used, but never has to be. Okay, last topic in this video. When you are placarding sometimes you have to use the UN number. And that's that UN number we were looking at before, like UN 1090. You do have to use it when the load is bulk. So if the hazardous material inside is a bulk hazmat load, you now need to display the UN number on the placard itself. The other time you need to use it is when the aggregate gross weight of the hazardous material is 8,820 pounds or more, and it's the only hazmat on that vehicle. So for instance, if you had a Class 8 load that was nothing but Class 8 corrosive material, no other substance or material inside, that Class 8 material would now require the placard to have the UN number associated with it.